November 12, 1942. The beaches of Oran, Algeria. The metallic screech of landing craft ramps dropping onto sand mixed with the roar of engines as strange hybrid vehicles rolled onto African soil. To German intelligence officers observing from captured French positions, these machines appeared almost comical. Part truck, part tank, neither fish nor fowl. American half-tracks lumbering off landing craft toward an uncertain future against the battle-hardened veterans of the Afrika Korps. Field reports transmitted back to Berlin described them as lightly armoured compromises, vulnerable to mines through their thin floor plates, exposed to artillery through their open tops. The consensus among Wehrmacht planners was immediate. These were targets, not threats. Within 18 months, that assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. The M3 Halftrack would transform from an object of tactical doubt into one of the most versatile weapon systems ever deployed. Its ability to adapt, to multiply roles, to be everywhere simultaneously, would redefine armoured infantry warfare and demonstrate a truth the Germans were only beginning to understand. That American military might wasn't about individual weapon superiority. It was about industrial capacity married to operational flexibility. The mathematics of victory were already loaded into those hybrid chassis. Over 40,000 units produced, dozens of specialised variants, deployment on every front simultaneously, enough concentrated versatility to transport an entire army, defend it from the air, support it with mobile artillery, and evacuate its wounded. All from a single basic platform that German industry could never hope to match in scale. This is the story of how an ungainly compromise became America's Swiss Army knife of mechanized warfare, how industrial pragmatism defeated tactical perfection, and how German commanders learned too late that the most dangerous weapon isn't always the most elegant one. The M3 Halftrack had emerged from a crisis of confidence. As German panzers carved through France in May 1940, American military planners faced an uncomfortable truth. The United States Army was fundamentally unprepared for mechanized warfare. Infantry divisions still marched on foot. Artillery was horse-drawn. The tactical mobility that had given Germany its lightning victories simply did not exist in the American arsenal. The Ordnance Department had been experimenting with half-track vehicles since the early 1930s, testing French-designed Citroën Kégresse vehicles that combined wheeled steering with tracked propulsion. The concept was elegant. Tracks provided cross-country mobility and traction. Wheels provided steering simplicity and road speed. Together they offered a compromise between the complexity of fully tracked vehicles and the limitations of wheeled trucks. The White Motor Company, working with Army engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground, had developed the M2 Halftrack in 1940. This vehicle was designed primarily as an artillery tractor, with room for just the gun crew and ammunition storage. At 10 inches shorter than what would become the M3, it could transport 10 men but lacked the space needed for a full infantry squad. Major General Jacob Devers, commanding the armoured force, recognised the limitation immediately. Modern armoured warfare required infantry to keep pace with tanks. They needed protection from small arms and shell fragments. They needed to arrive at the objective ready to fight, not exhausted from marching. The solution was simple. Lengthen the M2's hull by 10 inches, add a rear door for rapid egress, and redesign the interior to accommodate 13 men. A complete rifle squad plus driver and vehicle commander. The result was the M3 Halftrack, accepted for service in May 1941. At 20 feet 3 inches long, 7 feet wide, and weighing 17,650 pounds loaded, it was powered by a White 160AX inline 6-cylinder gasoline engine producing 148 horsepower. This gave it a top speed of 45 miles per hour on roads and a range of 220 miles. The armour was modest. 6 to 12 millimeters of face-hardened steel plate, enough to stop rifle bullets and shell fragments but useless against anything heavier. The front was more heavily protected, with adjustable armoured shutters for the radiator and bulletproof glass panels for the windshield. But the sides were thin and the top was completely open. Early models mounted a single .50 caliber M2 Browning machine gun on a pedestal mount behind the front seats. Later M3A1 variants adopted the M49 pulpit mount, a raised armoured position over the passenger seat that gave the gunner better fields of fire. Additional .30 caliber M1919 machine guns could be mounted on pintlers along the sides. The vehicle could carry its squad, their weapons, ammunition, rations and combat equipment across terrain that would bog down conventional trucks. The front wheels were powered and synchronized with a track drive, giving it four-wheel and track traction that was revolutionary for its time. Production began in earnest in mid-1941. The Autocar Company, Diamond T Motor Company, and White Motor Company all tooled up for manufacture, using as many commercial components as possible to speed production and simplify maintenance. By December 1941, when America entered the war, several hundred M3 Halftracks had been delivered to training units. The first combat deployment came with tragic timing. 50 M3 Halftracks were shipped to the Philippines in late 1941, arriving just as Japanese forces began their invasion. The Provisional Tank Group, equipped with these brand new vehicles, discovered multiple mechanical problems under combat conditions. Track assemblies broke, engines overheated. The open top made them vulnerable to Japanese snipers in the jungle canopy. After-action reports painted a grim picture. The M3 was unreliable, mechanically suspect and tactically questionable. The Ordnance Department scrambled to address the issues. Track assemblies were strengthened. Engine cooling was improved. Spring-loaded rear idlers replaced the fixed design that had proven fragile on rough terrain. By the time Operation Torch launched in November 1942, most of these problems had been resolved. But the vehicle's reputation had been permanently damaged among troops who nicknamed it the Purple Heart Box, a grim reference to the decoration awarded for combat wounds. The name stuck because it was brutally accurate. Machine gun fire could penetrate the thin-side armour. Artillery airbursts found the open top with devastating effect. Mines, the scourge of North African warfare, could punch through the floor and devastate the crew compartment. Lieutenant Colonel Omar Bradley, observing M3 operations in Tunisia, summarised the problem perfectly in his after-action report. It is a competent and dependable contrivance. Its bad name resulted from the inexperience of our troops who attempted to use it for too many things. This assessment would prove prophetic. The M3's greatest weakness, its lack of specialised protection, was also its greatest strength. Because it wasn't optimised for any single role, it could be adapted for dozens. What German intelligence failed to recognise in those early encounters was that they weren't looking at a flawed tank or inadequate armoured car. They were witnessing the foundation of America's mechanized warfare revolution. The first hint of the M3's true potential came not from its designed role as personnel carrier, but from desperate improvisation. In October 1941, as the Philippines braced for Japanese invasion, Army Ordnance officers realised they had a critical shortage of mobile anti-tank weapons. The solution was improvised brilliance. Mount surplus French 75 Versatility M1897 guns dating from World War I on M3 half-track chassis. Strip away the upper hull sides, weld in a simple gun shield. The result was the T-12 gun motor carriage, quickly redesignated the M3 GMC. It was crude, ungainly, and completely exposed. The gun crew stood in the open, protected only by a thin shield. But it was mobile, could be produced quickly, and mounted a weapon capable of destroying any tank then in service. By 1942, production had ramped up to over 2,000 units. The 75 mm gun, while obsolete for modern artillery, had adequate armour-piercing capability against Japanese and early German tanks. More importantly, its high explosive shells were devastating against fortifications and infantry. The M3 GMC first saw action in the Philippines, where its mobility and firepower proved valuable in the desperate fighting retreats of early 1942. Then came North Africa. 6 tank destroyer battalions, equipped primarily with M3 GMCs, participated in Operation Torch. The initial results were disastrous. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German armoured counterattacks caught American forces unprepared. M3 GMCs, positioned for defensive ambushes, were overrun by coordinated panzer attacks. Their thin armour and open fighting compartments made them death traps when caught by high explosive shells. 21 M3 GMCs were lost in a single engagement, but then came El Gueta. On March 23, 1943, the 10th Panzer Division launched a counterattack against American positions. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with 31 M3 GMCs, had learned from Kasserine. They positioned for flanking fire, used hit-and-run tactics, and coordinated with artillery. When the German armour advanced, expecting to overwhelm American positions as they had at Kasserine, they instead ran into a killing ground. The M3 GMCs, firing from concealed positions, destroyed German tanks at ranges where their thin armour didn't matter. The 75mm guns, while not ideal anti-tank weapons, were adequate when fired at side and rear armour. Combined with the M10 tank destroyers of the 899th Battalion, they claimed 37 German tanks. The cost was heavy. 21 M3 GMCs were destroyed. But the Germans had learned a crucial lesson. These improvised gun carriers, properly employed, were lethal. The M3 GMC would serve throughout the war in the Pacific, where its firepower was more than adequate against Japanese light and medium tanks. At Saipan, Peleliu, and Okinawa, Marine Corps M3 GMCs provided mobile fire support, their 75mm guns reducing fortifications that had stopped previous assaults. Eventually, 360 M3 GMCs were converted back into standard personnel carriers as more capable tank destroyers entered service. But the lesson had been learned. The M3 Halftrack chassis could mount heavy weapons and create effective, if vulnerable, gun platforms. This versatility was just beginning. While the M3 GMC demonstrated offensive potential, another variant would prove even more valuable, the M16 multiple-gun motor carriage. In early 1943, as American forces prepared for the invasion of Sicily, the need for mobile anti-aircraft defense became critical. German and Italian aircraft still contested the skies, and strafing runs against ground columns were devastatingly effective. The solution emerged from earlier experiments. The WL Maxon Corporation had developed the M33 twin mount, featuring two .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. It was effective but lacked sufficient firepower. Maxon's engineers quadrupled the design. The M45 quad mount featured 4 M2 Brownings arranged in pairs, electrically powered for traverse and elevation, capable of throwing out 200 rounds per minute of combined fire. Mount this on an M3 Halftrack chassis, and you had the M16 MGMC. The vehicle entered production in May 1943. By March 1944, 277 had been produced by White Motor Company, with an additional 568 M3 MGMCs and 109 earlier models converted to the M16 standard. The design was elegant in its lethality. The quad mount could traverse 360 degrees and elevate from -10 to +90 degrees. A gunner sat in an armoured cockpit with a sophisticated gun sight, featuring built-in lead calculations. 2 loaders fed the weapons using 200-round magazines. Each gun fired 550 rounds per minute. Together they created a wall of lead that no low-flying aircraft could penetrate. The M16's combat debut in Tunisia immediately revealed its effectiveness. During the final Tunisian campaign in 1943, M16s of the 1st Armoured Division claimed 78 aircraft destroyed. German pilots quickly learned to give American convoys protected by the distinctive quad-mounted half-tracks a wide berth. Oberleutnant Werner Schmidt of Jagdgeschwader 77 recorded in his combat diary after a strafing run gone wrong, attacked American column near Bizerta, saw the quad mount too late. Obergefreiter Heller's Stuka disintegrated in mid-air, counted over 100 hits in less than 2 seconds. Nothing could survive that fire. Recommended all pilots avoid any column with visible quad mounts. The M16 earned 2 nicknames that perfectly captured its nature: the meat chopper for what it did to aircraft caught in its fire, and the Krautmauer for what happened when it was turned on ground targets. Because by the time of the Normandy invasion, Allied air superiority was so complete that M16s rarely engaged aircraft. Instead, they were turned on German infantry and light vehicles with horrifying effectiveness. A 2-second burst put roughly 73 half-inch bullets into a target zone the size of a truck. Against infantry in the open, the effect was apocalyptic. German after-action reports from Normandy repeatedly referenced the quad-mount half-tracks with a mixture of fear and respect. From a Wehrmacht report dated July 15, 1944, the American flak wagon with 4 heavy machine guns has proven extremely effective against our infantry in the open. Single bursts can eliminate entire squads. The psychological effect is severe. Men refuse to advance when these vehicles are present. Recommend all possible efforts to destroy these weapons before infantry operations. The M16 served throughout the European campaign, at the Battle of the Bulge, during the drive into Germany. In the Pacific, it proved equally valuable, with 1,000 M17 variants, built on the M5 Halftrack chassis, supplied to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. In Korea, demand for M16s was so intense that 1,662 M3A1 personnel carriers were converted to M16A1 standard by adding the quadmount. The vehicle remained in US service until 1954, replaced finally by more sophisticated radar-directed systems. But for over a decade, the M16 had been the most feared anti-aircraft and anti-infantry platform in the American arsenal, all built on the humble M3 Halftrack chassis. The adaptability didn't stop there. The M3 platform spawned over 70 distinct variants during and after World War II. Each demonstrated the fundamental genius of the design, a simple, reliable chassis that could be modified for virtually any role mechanized forces required. The M15 multiple-gun motor carriage combined a 37mm automatic cannon with twin 50 caliber machine guns in an armoured turret. It provided heavier anti-aircraft fire than the M16, with approximately 2,250 units produced. The 37mm gun could engage aircraft at longer ranges, while the machine guns provided the volume of fire needed against close targets. M15s served from Tunisia through the end of the war in Europe and saw extensive combat in Korea before being phased out. Mortar carriers transformed the M3 into mobile artillery. The M4 and M21 variants mounted 81mm mortars that could be fired from within the vehicle, providing infantry units with immediate indirect fire support. The M4A1 mounted the mortar on a turntable, allowing faster traverse. Over 600 M21 mortar carriers were produced, serving in every theatre. The value was immediate. Infantry companies could bring their own artillery support, firing from covered positions and displacing before counter-battery fire arrived. The T-48 gun motor carriage mounted the 57mm M1 anti-tank gun, an American copy of the British 6-pounder. While the 75mm GMC had proven marginal against German armour, the 57mm had much better armour-piercing performance. 962 T-48s were produced, with 650 supplied to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, where they were designated Su-57. Soviet crews praised the vehicle's reliability and the gun's effectiveness against German tanks. The T-19 and T-30 howitzer motor carriages mounted 105mm and 75mm howitzers respectively, providing armoured artillery support. These saw limited production but demonstrated the platform's flexibility. The French army used T-30s extensively in Indochina after the war, where their mobility and firepower proved valuable in counterinsurgency operations. Specialized command vehicles, equipped with extra radios and map boards, provided mobile headquarters for armoured and mechanized units. Ambulance variants evacuated wounded under fire, their cross-country mobility getting casualties to aid stations that wheeled ambulances couldn't reach. Engineer variants carried demolition equipment and mine-clearing devices. Every role that required mobility, some armour protection, and the ability to keep pace with tanks found expression in an M3 variant. This was the vehicle's true genius. It wasn't optimized for anything, so it could be adapted for everything. The German equivalent, the Scarcity 251, was more heavily armoured and more sophisticated in design. It was also far more expensive to produce, requiring complex manufacturing that German industry increasingly couldn't sustain. A single SDKF Z251 required approximately 3,000 man-hours to build. An M3 Halftrack required under 2,500. The German vehicle was superior in individual combat. The American vehicle was superior in industrial reality. By 1944, American factories were producing half-tracks faster than Germany could destroy them, and that made all the difference. The M3's role as personnel carrier, its original design purpose, proved revolutionary in practice. Each armoured division was allocated 433 M3 half-tracks, 200 in the armoured regiments, 233 in the armoured infantry regiment. This gave American armoured divisions something German panzer divisions never achieved: true mechanized infantry that could keep pace with tanks across any terrain. A typical armoured rifle company was allocated 20 M3 half-tracks, 3 for company headquarters, serving as command vehicle, maintenance section transport, and ambulance. The 3 rifle platoons each received 5 half-tracks, 1 for platoon headquarters, 3 for rifle squads of 12 men each, 1 for the 60mm mortar squad and light machine gun squad. The anti-tank platoon used 3 more vehicles. This organisation meant an entire armoured infantry battalion could move at tank speed, arriving at objectives fresh and ready to fight. The tactical implications were enormous. While German mechanized infantry still largely moved in trucks, dismounting far from the front lines and marching forward, American armoured infantry could button up in their half-tracks and drive directly into combat zones. The vehicle's machine guns provided suppressive fire during dismount. The armour protected against small arms during the approach. The rear door allowed rapid egress under fire. General George Patton, never one for understatement, described the impact perfectly in a letter to General Devers in August 1944. The half-track has proven the single most valuable piece of equipment in my command after the tank itself. It has permitted offensive operations at a tempo the Germans cannot match. They run out of infantry before we run out of ground. The mobility manifests itself in unexpected ways. During the breakout from Normandy in late July 1944, Patton's Third Army advanced so rapidly that supply lines couldn't keep up. Columns of M3 Halftracks, designed to carry infantry, were pressed into service hauling fuel, ammunition and supplies. Their cross-country mobility meant they could bypass clogged roads and deliver critical supplies directly to forward units. The famous Red Ball Express, which kept Patton's advance supplied across France, included thousands of trucks. But the real breakthrough came from half-track mounted supply units that could follow the armour off-road, through destroyed towns, across country that no wheeled vehicle could navigate. German commanders watching this advance reported something they had never seen before: an entire army moving at mechanized speed, with every element, combat and support, keeping pace. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's assessment, captured in September 1944, was stark. The American half-track has given them operational mobility we cannot counter. They advance with their entire force, infantry, artillery, supply, all at the same speed. When we counter-attack, we face not just tanks but entire mechanized formations already positioned. We are fighting a 19th century war against an enemy conducting 20th century operations. The production figures told the story. From 1941 through 1944, American industry produced approximately 41,000 M3 half-tracks in all variants. About 15,000 were standard M3 and M3A1 personnel carriers. The remaining 26,000 were specialized variants. 2,177 M16 quad-mount anti-aircraft vehicles, 202 M3 GMC 75mm gun carriers, 250 M15 anti-aircraft vehicles with 37mm guns, 962 T-48 57mm tank destroyers, over 600 mortar carriers, hundreds more command vehicles, ambulances, and specialized variants. 3 manufacturers, Autocar, Diamond T and White, produced these vehicles using largely commercial components. The chassis was derived from commercial truck designs. The engine was a modified commercial unit. The tracks used rubber pads over steel cable, technology developed for agricultural and construction equipment. This commercial basis had 3 critical advantages. First, production could scale rapidly. Factories didn't need to develop entirely new manufacturing processes. They adapted existing truck production lines, adding armour fabrication and final assembly. Second, maintenance was simplified. Mechanics familiar with commercial trucks could service half-tracks. Parts were interchangeable. Field repairs were straightforward. Third, reliability improved. Commercial components were proven in civilian use. They broke less frequently than purpose-built military designs. When they did break, replacements were readily available. The contrast with German production was stark. The SDKF Z251 required specialized manufacturing. Its complex suspension used components unique to the vehicle. Its armor was more sophisticated, requiring specialized welding and assembly. Each vehicle took longer to build and was harder to maintain. By 1944, Germany was producing approximately 4,000 SSDKF-Z 251 half-tracks annually, about one-third the American rate. Moreover, German vehicles were increasingly built with substitute materials as strategic shortages bit. American half-tracks, by contrast, improved in quality as production experience accumulated. Late-war M3A1 vehicles incorporated lessons learned from 3 years of combat. Spring-loaded idlers eliminated the track-braking problems of early models. Improved armoured windscreen mounts provided better protection. The M49 pulpit mount gave machine gunners better fields of fire. External racks for mines and equipment were standardized. The vehicle that landed at Normandy in June 1944 was dramatically better, than the one that had struggled in the Philippines in 1942, and America was building them by the hundreds every week. The industrial capacity this represented was something Germany simply could not match. The half-track production was just one part of a massive military-industrial machine. The same factories building half-tracks also produced trucks, scout cars, and armoured cars. The same supply chain supported tank production, aircraft manufacturing, and ship construction. When German commanders captured American vehicles and studied them, they found something terrifying. These machines weren't individually superior. The Sekevs 251 was probably a better armoured personnel carrier in purely military terms, but that missed the point entirely. American vehicles were designed to be built by the thousands, to be maintained by minimally trained mechanics, to use common parts and simple systems. The M3 Halftrack embodied a philosophy of warfare that Germany had never fully grasped. Quantity has a quality all its own, but only when that quantity can be sustained. American industry could build 40,000 half-tracks and keep them running. German industry could build perhaps 20,000 SDKFZ vehicles across all types, and couldn't keep even those operational due to parts shortages. By late 1944, captured German maintenance reports revealed that over 60% of ZTFZ half-tracks were non-operational due to parts shortages, even when the vehicles themselves were mechanically sound. American half-tracks, by contrast, maintained 85% operational readiness rates even in heavy combat. This wasn't because American vehicles were more reliable, it was because the supply system could deliver parts. The parts were standardized, and mechanics were trained on commercial equipment similar to the military vehicles. Every M3 half-track destroyed could be replaced within weeks. Every crew trained on the vehicle could transition to any variant because the basic controls and systems were identical. Every mechanic could service the entire fleet because the core components were shared. The Germans, watching their own half-track fleet dwindle through attrition and maintenance failures, could only document the disparity. From a Wehrmacht quartermaster report, November 1944, American half-track losses appear to have no operational impact. Destroyed vehicles are replaced immediately. Our intelligence indicates their production continues at full capacity despite strategic bombing. We estimate they can sustain current loss rates indefinitely while maintaining or increasing force strength. Our own production cannot replace current losses. Within 6 months, our mechanized infantry formations will be largely truck mobile, reducing tactical flexibility significantly. The M3 half-track service didn't end with World War II. The vehicle's adaptability and reliability ensured decades of continued use. Over 5,000 vehicles were supplied to Allied nations through Lend-Lease during the war. Britain, Canada, France, and the Soviet Union all received substantial numbers. These vehicles remained in service for years after 1945. The French army used M3 half-tracks extensively in Indochina and Algeria, where their cross-country mobility proved valuable in counterinsurgency operations. The last French M3s weren't retired until the early 1960s. The Soviet Union received approximately 800 Lawson M-Yasu and M3 personnel carriers and 1,000 M17 anti-aircraft variants during the war. Soviet crews praised their reliability compared to domestic designs. Many remained in service through the 1950s, but the most extensive post-war user was Israel. Between 1948 and the 1960s, Israel acquired thousands of surplus American half-tracks. These vehicles became the backbone of Israeli mechanized forces during the 1948 War of Independence, the 1956 Suez Crisis, and the 1967 Six-Day War. Israeli engineers continuously upgraded the vehicles, developing dozens of variants for specific combat roles. The ultimate evolution was the M3 TCM-20, which mounted a power-driven turret with twin 20-cm Hispano-Suiza automatic cannons. This variant proved devastatingly effective against anti-tank missile teams during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The rapid-fire cannon forced enemy teams to take cover, suppressing them so they couldn't effectively guide their missiles. Israeli M3 half-tracks remained in frontline service until the early 1990s, over 50 years after the original design entered production. Some variants continued in reserve and training roles into the 21st century. This longevity testified to the fundamental soundness of the design. In American service, M3 half-tracks fought in Korea from 1950 to 1953. The M16 quadmount variant proved particularly valuable, earning its meat chopper nickname during Chinese human wave attacks. The concentrated firepower of 450 caliber machine guns could break up massed infantry assaults, and the vehicles provided convoy security throughout the war. The last M16s were retired from US Army service in 1954, replaced by more sophisticated air defense systems. But standard M3 personnel carriers remained in National Guard service through the late 1950s. When the final American M3 was retired in 1960, the vehicle had served for 19 years, far longer than typical for military equipment. Looking back from the perspective of military history, the M3 Halftrack represents a pivotal moment in armoured warfare doctrine. It wasn't the first half-track. German forces had pioneered the type in the 1930s. It wasn't the most sophisticated. The German SDKFZ series had superior armour and suspension. It wasn't even the most comfortable. British and Canadian troops called it bone-jarring to ride in. But it was the most successful half-track ever built, and the reasons for that success illuminate broader truths about industrial warfare. The M3 succeeded because it embraced compromise. It didn't try to be a light tank, though it had tracks. It didn't try to be a heavy truck, though it had wheels. It occupied a middle ground that proved tactically valuable. The armour protection wasn't heavy enough to stop anti-tank weapons, but it didn't need to be. The vehicle wasn't meant to fight tanks. It needed to protect infantry from small arms and shell fragments, while transporting them rapidly across broken terrain. For that role, thin armour was adequate. The open top was a constant complaint from troops who rode in it. But that open top meant the vehicle was lighter, simpler to produce, and easier to adapt for carrying varying loads. Troops could bring extra ammunition, equipment, even bicycles and motorcycles for reconnaissance. The flexibility this provided outweighed the protection a roof would have offered. The vehicle's speed of 45 miles per hour seems modest by modern standards, but in World War II, it was adequate to keep pace with tanks and dramatically faster than infantry on foot. That speed, combined with cross-country mobility, meant American mechanized forces could maintain operational tempos that exhausted German defenders. Most critically, the M3 embraced the American industrial model: simple design, commercial components, standardized production. This meant it could be built by the thousands and maintained by minimally trained mechanics. In total war, where attrition matters more than individual superiority, this approach proved decisive. The German half-track force never exceeded 20,000 vehicles of all types. The American force exceeded 40,000, and that's just the M3 family. Include M2 variants, and the total pushes past 55,000 vehicles. When the Germans captured and pressed M3 half-tracks into service, their evaluations were telling. They praised the vehicle's reliability and ease of maintenance. They noted that American-trained mechanics could service them with minimal tools. They observed that parts were remarkably durable. What they didn't comment on was tactical superiority, because there wasn't any. The M3 wasn't a better fighting vehicle than the SDKF Z251. It was a better production vehicle, and in industrial warfare, that was what mattered. The final assessment came from an unlikely source. SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th Panzer Army during the Battle of the Bulge, was captured in May 1945. During interrogation, he was asked about American equipment. His comments on the M3 half-track, recorded in interrogation transcripts, captured the vehicle's significance perfectly. The American half-track was everywhere. Every unit had them. When we destroyed 10, 20 more appeared. When we captured them, we used them because they were more reliable than our own vehicles. They weren't sophisticated, they weren't heavily armoured, but they never stopped coming. That was what defeated us. Not any single American weapon, but the weight of their entire industrial system. They could lose equipment faster than we could destroy it and still grow stronger. We could win every tactical engagement and still lose the operational battle because they simply had more of everything. The half-track symbolised this. Simple, adequate, unstoppable through sheer numbers. By the time we understood this, it was far too late to counter it. The M3 half-track didn't win World War II through tactical brilliance or technological superiority. It won through operational presence and industrial sustainability. It was there, everywhere, all the time, transporting infantry, hauling supplies, providing anti-aircraft defence, supporting advances with mobile artillery, evacuating wounded, serving as mobile command posts, and when one was destroyed, 2 more arrived to replace it. This was the revolution that Germany never fully grasped. Modern war wasn't about individual weapon superiority. It was about system integration and sustainable production. The half-track was one piece of a larger mechanized warfare system that included tanks, trucks, artillery, aircraft, and naval support. Each piece was adequate rather than exceptional, but together, supported by American industrial capacity, they created a military force that couldn't be defeated through tactical skill alone. The Germans had started the war with superior tanks, better tactics, and more experienced troops. They lost it to an enemy with adequate weapons, sound tactics, and unlimited industrial capacity. The M3 Halftrack, ugly and ungainly, neither fish nor fowl, personified this truth. It was a vehicle that shouldn't have worked in theory, but proved invaluable in practice. A compromise that became a weapon system, a temporary expedient that served for 2 decades, an American solution to a European problem. And in the end, it was enough. More than enough. It was exactly what was needed. Produced in exactly the quantities required, sustained by an industrial base the Axis powers could never hope to match. When the last M3 Halftrack was finally retired from Israeli service in the 1990s, over 50 years after the first examples rolled off production lines, the vehicle had served longer than any other armoured vehicle of World War II. This longevity was the final verdict on its design. The Germans had laughed at the strange hybrid vehicles crawling off landing craft in North Africa in November 1942. By May 1945 there was no one left to laugh. The half-tracks had won. Not through elegance or sophistication, but through the brutal mathematics of industrial warfare. 40,000 vehicles against 20,000. Sustainability against scarcity. The unstoppable against the excellent. And in that equation the outcome was never really in doubt. The M3 Halftrack had proven what would become a defining principle of American military power, that adequate weapons, produced in overwhelming numbers and sustained by industrial might, would always defeat superior weapons that couldn't be maintained or replaced. It was a lesson Germany learned too late, and one that echoed through every subsequent American military conflict for the next 50 years. The half-track had spoken, and its voice was the thunder of American industry. The evolution of half-track tactics deserves deeper examination because it reveals how American forces transformed a vehicle designed for simple transportation into a weapon system that fundamentally altered battlefield dynamics. The learning curve was steep and paid for in blood during those early North African campaigns. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Robinette, commanding Combat Command B of the 1st Armoured Division during the Kasserine Pass disaster, wrote a detailed, after-action report that became required reading at the Command and General Staff School. His observations about half-track employment were brutally honest. We used them wrong. We treated them as light tanks, pushing them forward without infantry support. We parked them in defensive positions as if their thin armour would protect the crews. We learned that half-tracks survive through mobility, not protection. The vehicle must keep moving or it becomes a coffin. This lesson was relearned painfully across Tunisia. At Sidi Bouzid in February 1943, American forces positioned M3 half-tracks in static defensive positions. When German armour attacked, the half-tracks couldn't manoeuvre and were systematically destroyed by long-range tank fire. Their thin armour, adequate against small arms, was useless against 75mm and 80mm guns. Crews who tried to fight from their vehicles died. Those who dismounted and used the half-tracks for mobility survived. By the time of the final Tunisian offensive in April and May 1943, American doctrine had evolved significantly. Half-tracks were employed as battle taxis, rushing infantry to objectives under the protection of tank and artillery fire. The vehicles would approach to within 200 yards of enemy positions, suppressing defenders with their machine guns while infantry dismounted. The half-tracks would then withdraw to covered positions, waiting to evacuate casualties or reposition forces as needed. This tactic proved devastatingly effective during the assault on Hill 609, a critical German defensive position. The 1st Armoured Division used its half-tracks to rapidly shift infantry units between attack positions, keeping German defenders off balance. When one approach was blocked, entire companies could be repositioned in minutes rather than the hours foot-mobile infantry would have required. Major General Orlando Ward, commanding the 1st Armoured Division, reported that half-track mobility had increased his infantry's effective strength by roughly 40%. Units could be committed to action fresh rather than exhausted from marching. They could be withdrawn and recommitted multiple times in a single day. The operational tempo this enabled was something German forces, still largely dependent on foot-mobile infantry, simply couldn't match. The Sicily invasion in July 1943 revealed another crucial half-track advantage. Amphibious landings required vehicles that could be driven directly off landing craft onto beaches, operate in sand and broken terrain, and move inland rapidly before defenders could organise counterattacks. Wheeled vehicles bogged down in sand. Tracked vehicles were too heavy for many landing craft and too slow on roads. Half-tracks provided the perfect compromise. The 2nd Armoured Division landed its half-tracks directly onto the beaches near Gila. Within hours, entire armoured infantry battalions were moving inland, their half-tracks navigating terrain that would have stopped trucks and moving faster than fully tracked vehicles on the coastal roads. When German panzer units counterattacked toward the beaches on July 11th, they encountered not disorganised beachhead forces, but fully mechanized American units already positioned inland. The ensuing battle saw M3 half-tracks used in ways their designers never intended. Crews discovered that by driving at high speed and traversing sharply, they could use their mobility to evade tank fire. The technique was called jinking, and while it didn't make half-tracks capable of fighting tanks, it did make them harder to hit. Combined with the vehicle's surprising cross-country speed, this meant half-track units could disengage from armour threats and reposition rapidly. Captain Henry Gardner of the 41st Armoured Infantry Regiment recorded the evolution of these tactics in his personal diary. July 14, 1943. Lost 2 half-tracks today to German tanks. Both were trying to fight from static positions. 3rd half-track, commanded by Sergeant Morrison, survived by going evasive. He drove directly at the Panzer at full speed, then cut hard right at about 100 yards. The German gunner couldn't track him. Morrison's squad dismounted behind cover and engaged with bazookas. Panzer destroyed. Morrison's half-track has 47 bullet holes but no serious damage. Recommendation: emphasize mobility as primary defense. Never stop moving in the engagement zone. The Italian campaign that followed Sicily's fall provided a different challenge. The mountainous terrain of mainland Italy seemed unsuited for mechanized warfare. Roads were narrow and easily blocked. Mountains channeled movement into predictable routes. German forces, masters of defensive warfare, turned Italy into a fortress. Yet here too the half-track proved its worth. Its cross-country mobility meant American units could leave the roads and traverse terrain that wheeled vehicles couldn't navigate. Entire battalions could be moved along mountain tracks and farm roads, outflanking German defensive positions anchored on the main highways. At the Rapido River in January 1944, half-tracks couldn't cross the flooded terrain directly, but they could position close to the river, providing suppressive fire with their machine guns while engineers constructed bridges. Once bridges were complete, the half-tracks were the first vehicles across, rushing infantry forward before German artillery could range in. The Anzio landing in January 1944 demonstrated the full maturity of American half-track doctrine. The 1st Armoured Division landed entire armoured infantry battalions directly onto the beachhead. Within 24 hours, these units had pushed inland and established defensive positions that German counterattacks couldn't penetrate. When Field Marshal Albert Kesselring launched his counteroffensive to drive the Allies back into the sea, he encountered mechanized American infantry that could redeploy faster than his attacks could develop. German units would mass for attack against one sector, only to find American half-tracks had already shifted forces to meet them. Kesselring's frustration was evident in a message to Berlin dated February 18, 1944. The American mobility advantage is more significant than previously assessed. Their armoured infantry can reposition entire battalions in under 1 hour. Our infantry requires 4 to 6 hours for equivalent movement. This allows them to concentrate forces at decisive points while our attacks develop. Recommend priority effort to destroy their half-track transport. Without it, their infantry becomes ordinary. The recommendation was sound tactically but impossible operationally. By early 1944, American forces had hundreds of half-tracks in Italy. German air power was negligible. Artillery could destroy individual vehicles but couldn't interdict entire formations. The half-track fleet was simply too numerous and too dispersed to neutralize. The preparation for D-Day involved the largest concentration of half-tracks ever assembled. 9 American infantry divisions designated for the Normandy invasion included armoured attachments. The separate tank battalions and tank destroyer battalions that would support them brought additional half-tracks. In total, Over 3,000 half-tracks participated in the Normandy campaign. The roles they filled revealed the vehicle's complete integration into American combined arms doctrine. Standard M3 and M3A1 personnel carriers transported armoured infantry and motorised units. M16 quad-mount half-tracks provided convoy air defence and devastating ground fire support. M15 half-tracks with their 37mm cannons engaged fortifications. Mortar carriers provided immediate indirect fire support. Command variants served as mobile headquarters. Ambulance variants evacuated casualties. Engineer half-tracks carried demolition equipment and bridging materials. No other vehicle served so many functions simultaneously. The Normandy hedgerow fighting showed both the half-track's limitations and its adaptability. The bocage terrain, with its maze of sunken roads and impenetrable hedgerows, seemed to negate mechanized warfare advantages. German infantry, armed with Panzerfausts and dug into the hedgerows, could ambush half-tracks in the narrow lanes. Early losses were heavy. The 2nd Armoured Division lost 23 half-tracks in the first week of hedgerow fighting, but American ingenuity produced a solution. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron welded steel prongs cut from German beach obstacles onto tank hulls. These hedgerow cutters allowed tanks to crash through the thick vegetation. The idea was quickly adapted. Half-tracks equipped with similar devices could follow the tanks through the gaps, bringing infantry directly into German defensive positions without exposing them to fire in the sunken lanes. Combined with the now standard tactic of using M16 quad mounts to suppress hedgerows with overwhelming firepower before infantry advanced, American forces developed a system for clearing the bocage methodically. It was slow and costly, but it worked. The half-track's contribution was mobility under conditions where mobility should have been impossible. Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy in late July 1944, showcased half-track doctrine at its most refined. When American forces punched through German lines near St. Lo, the pursuit phase required speed above all else. Tank units raced ahead, but they needed infantry support to secure objectives and clear resistance. Half-track mounted armoured infantry provided that support. The 2nd and 3rd Armoured Divisions, driving toward Avranches, moved so rapidly that German forces couldn't establish defensive lines. Whenever resistance formed, half-track mounted infantry would dismount, reduce the position, and remount for continued advance. All within hours rather than the days foot-mobile infantry would have required. General Patton's Third Army, activated on August 1st and immediately committed to exploitation, depended absolutely on half-track mobility. His armoured divisions were designed around the principle of sustained high-speed advance. Each division's armoured infantry regiment, with its 233 half-tracks, provided the ground-holding capability that allowed the tank battalions to keep moving. The pursuit across France in August 1944 remains one of the most remarkable campaigns in military history. Third Army advanced over 400 miles in 26 days. This pace was possible only because every element of the army could move mechanically. Fuel and ammunition came forward in trucks and half-tracks. Infantry moved in half-tracks. Artillery was towed by half-tracks and trucks. Nothing marched. Everything rolled. German forces attempting to establish defensive lines found themselves outflanked before they could dig in. The speed of advance was sustained by an innovation that perfectly captured American pragmatism. When organized supply convoys couldn't keep up, combat units were authorized to requisition any available transport. Half-tracks designed to carry 13 infantrymen suddenly carried jerrycans of fuel, cases of ammunition, and food supplies. The vehicles proved remarkably adaptable. Their payload capacity of over 3,000 pounds meant they could haul substantial supplies while still transporting some personnel. Photographs from the period show half-tracks loaded with impossible arrays of equipment: spare tracks, jerry cans, ammunition boxes, ration crates, even captured German vehicles in tow. The crews made it work through improvisation and determination. Major William Falvey, S4 supply officer for the 4th Armoured Division, reported in September 1944 that fully one-third of division supplies during the August pursuit came forward in commandeered half-tracks. The vehicle had transformed from infantry transport to general-purpose logistics platform through pure operational necessity. The pause at the German border in September 1944, when fuel shortages finally halted the advance, provided time for maintenance and lessons learned assessment. The half-tracks had performed beyond expectations, but they showed where. track assemblies needed replacement, engines required overhaul, transmissions were stressed from months of continuous operation. The maintenance system proved equal to the challenge. Replacement tracks, engines and transmissions flowed forward from depots in England and newly liberated French ports. Within 3 weeks, operational readiness rates returned to over 80%. This maintenance capability, as much as the vehicles themselves, demonstrated American industrial warfare maturity. Technical bulletins issued during this period formalized tactics learned through combat. Half-tracks should approach defensive positions at high speed, using smoke for concealment when possible. Infantry should dismount at 150 to 200 yards, using the vehicle's machine guns for suppressive fire. Vehicles should immediately withdraw to covered positions 400 to 500 yards behind the assault line, ready to provide fire support or evacuation. Never position half-tracks in the forward edge of battle for extended periods. Never use half-tracks as fixed fighting positions. Always maximize mobility and minimize exposure. These principles, written in blood across Tunisia, Sicily, Italy and France, became doctrine that saved countless lives in the battles ahead. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 tested American forces against the last major German offensive in the West. The surprise attack caught numerous units unprepared, and in the initial chaos, equipment was abandoned and positions overrun, yet the half-tracks proved their worth in both defense and counterattack. At Bastogne, the encircled 101st Airborne Division was reinforced by elements of the 10th Armoured Division, including Combat Command B with its half-tracks. These vehicles provided mobile firepower that helped contain German attacks. M16 quad mounts positioned around the perimeter proved particularly valuable, their concentrated fire breaking up infantry assaults and denying German forces close approach. When the weather cleared and resupply became possible, half-tracks equipped with cargo racks hauled ammunition and supplies from airdropped bundles to forward positions. Their cross-country mobility in snow and ice exceeded that of wheeled trucks, making them critical for internal logistics within the besieged perimeter. The relief of Bastogne demonstrated half-track capabilities in winter offensive operations. The 4th Armoured Division's drive north through German positions required infantry to clear resistance and secure the flanks of the armoured columns. Half-track mounted armoured infantry performed this mission in sub-zero temperatures and deep snow. The vehicle's tracked propulsion provided traction that wheeled transport couldn't match. Their open tops, normally a vulnerability, actually proved advantageous in winter conditions. Crews could clear snow from the vehicle quickly, and visibility wasn't restricted by frozen windows or fogged glass. The heating systems, while minimal, were adequate for crews in motion. During the subsequent Allied counter-offensive in January 1945, half-tracks carried infantry through the Ardennes forests in conditions that would have stopped most military vehicles. The combination of front-wheel and track drive provided traction on icy roads. The power-to-weight ratio allowed them to push through snowdrifts. Units maintained operational mobility throughout the winter campaign. German defenders, increasingly reliant on foot mobile infantry due to fuel shortages, found themselves unable to match American mobility even in winter conditions that should have favoured defence. The ability to rapidly concentrate forces at breakthrough points gave American commanders initiative that German forces couldn't counter. The final drives into Germany in February and March 1945 saw American mechanized forces advancing against crumbling resistance. The half-track's role in this phase was less dramatic but no less important. With German forces disintegrating, the primary challenge became maintaining supply lines across devastated infrastructure. Bridges were destroyed, roads were cratered, rail lines were wrecked. Half-tracks, with their cross-country mobility, could bypass destroyed infrastructure. They forded rivers where bridges were gone. They traversed fields around crater roads. They climbed rubble-strewn streets in destroyed cities. This mobility kept supplies flowing to advancing units. The crossing of the Rhine River in March 1945 required bridging equipment and engineers to position under fire. Half-tracks carried engineer units directly to bridge sites, their armour providing some protection from small arms fire. Once bridges were established, half-tracks were among the first vehicles across, rushing infantry forward to expand beachheads before German forces could organise counterattacks. At Remagen, where the Ludendorff Bridge was captured intact on March 7th, half-tracks poured across carrying infantry to establish a perimeter. Within 24 hours, substantial forces had crossed, and German counterattacks attempting to destroy the bridgehead were contained. The speed of build-up that half-tracks enabled made the bridgehead impossible to eliminate. By April 1945, German resistance was collapsing across the front. American mechanized columns raced across Germany, covering distances in days that would have taken weeks for foot-mobile forces. The half-tracks maintained pace throughout, demonstrating the durability of their basic design. Vehicles that had landed at Normandy in June 1944 were still operational in Germany in April 1945. Some half-tracks had covered over 2,000 miles in combat conditions. Their engines, designed for 50,000 miles of civilian truck service, proved adequate for military service with proper maintenance. The track systems, continuously improved throughout production, were now reliable enough that track breakage, common in 1942, was rare by 1945. When German forces finally surrendered in May 1945, American units conducting occupation duties discovered thousands of captured M3 half-tracks in Wehrmacht service. German mechanics had kept them running, often in preference to domestic designs. Interrogations revealed that German units prized captured American half-tracks for their reliability. One captured SDKFC 251 maintenance manual had a margin note, presumably from a frustrated mechanic, stating that American half-tracks required half the maintenance time and 1/4 the spare parts of equivalent German vehicles. This was perhaps the ultimate validation. The enemy, when given the choice, preferred to use captured American equipment, not because it was tactically superior, but because it was operationally sustainable. In the Pacific theatre, half-track employment followed a different trajectory, but reached similar conclusions. The vast distances, jungle terrain, and amphibious nature of Pacific warfare created challenges distinct from European operations. Yet here too the M3 proved adaptable. Marine Corps and Army units operating in the Pacific initially questioned whether half-tracks had any role in jungle warfare. The vehicle seemed too large for narrow jungle trails, too vulnerable to ambush, too dependent on fuel in a theatre where logistics was always challenging. Combat experience proved these concerns partially valid but not disqualifying. At Saipan in June 1944, Marine half-tracks landed with assault waves and provided immediate mobile firepower. While they couldn't penetrate deep jungle, they could operate on coastal roads and cleared areas, providing fire support and transporting supplies. The M3 GMC 75mm gun carriers proved particularly valuable against Japanese fortifications. Their mobility allowed them to quickly shift firing positions, engaging bunkers from multiple angles. The 75mm gun, while inadequate against modern tanks, was devastating against concrete and log fortifications. At Peleliu in September 1944, the 1st Marine Division's half-track mounted units discovered that coral terrain, while different from European ground, was actually well suited to half-track mobility. The firm coral surface provided excellent traction. The lack of mud eliminated one of the vehicle's major European challenges. M16 quadmount half-tracks provided fire support during the brutal fighting for the Umabrogol ridges. Their ability to position rapidly and deliver sustained fire against cave positions made them valuable, despite their vulnerability to Japanese anti-tank guns in the close terrain. The Philippine campaign from October 1944 through the war's end saw the largest employment of half-tracks in the Pacific. The more developed road network on Luzon allowed greater use of mechanized forces. The 1st Cavalry Division, actually a mechanized infantry formation despite its name, used half-tracks extensively during the drive on Manila. The speed of advance, covering over 100 miles in 3 days, was possible only because the entire force was vehicle mobile. Half-tracks carried the assault elements, trucks brought up supplies, and the combination allowed sustained high-speed operations. During the fighting for Manila in February and March 1945, half-tracks provided mobile fire support in brutal urban combat. The M16 quad mounts proved effective against Japanese positions in buildings, their concentrated fire suppressing defenders and allowing infantry to advance. The fighting demonstrated that half-tracks, while designed for open-terrain mobile warfare, could adapt to urban combat when properly employed. The final battles of the Pacific War, had the invasion of Japan occurred, would have seen the largest concentration of American armour and mechanized forces yet assembled in the theatre. Planning documents for Operation Downfall allocated thousands of half-tracks for the invasion forces. Their role would have been critical for maintaining momentum during the assault phase. The atomic bombs that ended the war in August 1945 rendered these plans unnecessary. but the planning itself demonstrated how thoroughly the half-track had been integrated into American operational doctrine across all theatres. In both European and Pacific operations, the vehicle had proven itself through adaptability rather than specialisation. When the war ended in August 1945, the US military had over 35,000 half-tracks in service worldwide. They had served on every front, in every climate, under every condition. They had carried infantry across Africa, Europe, and the Pacific. They had provided anti-aircraft defence from Tunisia to the Philippines. They had hauled supplies, evacuated wounded, served as mobile command posts, mounted heavy weapons, and performed dozens of other roles. The statistical record of their service was impressive. In the European theatre alone, half-tracks had carried armoured infantry through campaigns spanning from Morocco to Czechoslovakia. They had participated in 4 major amphibious assaults. They had operated in desert heat and winter cold, in mountains and plains, in cities and forests. Operational readiness rates, typically above 80% even during heavy combat, exceeded those of more sophisticated vehicles. This reliability translated directly to combat effectiveness. Units could plan operations knowing their half-tracks would be available. Commanders could commit forces confidently, understanding their mobility was sustainable. The contrast with German forces, increasingly hampered by vehicle breakdowns and fuel shortages, was stark. American mobility improved throughout the war, while German mobility deteriorated. The loss rates told their own story. Approximately 11,500 half-tracks of all types were lost in combat or written off due to damage during the war. This represented roughly 28% of total production. By comparison, American tank losses exceeded 40% of production. The half-track's lower loss rate reflected both the nature of its employment and the effectiveness of its armour against the threats it typically faced. The vehicle wasn't meant to fight other armoured vehicles directly. It was meant to transport infantry, provide fire support, and maintain mobility. Within these parameters, its thin armour was adequate. When crews violated doctrine and used half-tracks as fighting vehicles against heavy weapons, losses spiked. When doctrine was followed, survivability was acceptable. The production numbers, over 41,000 M3 and M5 half-tracks in all variants, represented a massive industrial commitment. Each vehicle required approximately 1,500 man-hours to build. Total labour investment exceeded 60 million man-hours. The steel alone represented over 300,000 tonnes. The rubber for tracks exceeded 15,000 tonnes. These materials came from an economy simultaneously building tanks, trucks, aircraft, ships, and all the other instruments of modern war. The half-tracks were one part of a vast industrial mobilisation, yet they were produced without straining the system. The factories built them alongside commercial vehicles. The components came from existing supply chains. The workers learned to assemble them in weeks rather than months. This ease of production was itself a weapon. Germany could never hope to match it. The final irony of the M3 half-track story is that its greatest advocate was initially its harshest critic. General George Patton in 1942 had written to the Army Chief of Staff calling half-tracks a waste of resources. He argued that infantry should ride on tanks, that specialised personnel carriers were unnecessary luxury. By 1944, after commanding half-track-equipped forces across Sicily, Italy and France, his opinion had completely reversed. In a letter to Lieutenant General Jacob Devers in August 1944, Patton wrote that the half-track had proven indispensable and recommended that production be increased. His conversion was complete when, during a press conference in October 1944, a reporter asked what single piece of equipment had most contributed to Third Army's success. Patton's response was immediate: the half-track. It keeps my infantry moving. Everything else follows from that. This from a general famous for his advocacy of tank warfare, acknowledging that infantry mobility was the foundation of mechanized operations. The assessment was correct. Tanks could break through, but only infantry could hold ground, and only mechanized infantry could hold ground while maintaining the operational tempo that prevented enemy forces from establishing new defensive lines. The M3 half-track provided that mechanization. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't sophisticated, it was a simple machine that did a straightforward job. It moved infantry at tank speed across any terrain, and in doing that one thing reliably, it enabled everything else. The German commanders who had laughed at the hybrid vehicles in 1942 had failed to understand this fundamental truth. They saw the half-track as a flawed compromise. They missed that it was a force multiplier whose value came from integration into a larger system. By the time they understood their error, it was far too late. American industry had produced tens of thousands. American doctrine had evolved to employ them effectively. American forces had learned to maintain them under field conditions. The machine and the system that supported it had matured into an unstoppable combination. In the final analysis, the M3 Halftrack succeeded because it was good enough. Not perfect, not optimal, just adequate for the roles it filled, producible in the quantities required, and sustainable under combat conditions. In total war, where perfection is impossible and adequacy is victory, this was the highest praise. The Germans had pursued perfection with their SDKFZ series. Sophisticated designs built to high standards. They produced 23,000 across all variants, never enough to equip their forces fully, always struggling to maintain what they had. The Americans had pursued adequacy with their M3. Simple design built to commercial standards. They produced 41,000 in the half-track family, more than enough to equip their forces, with surplus for allies and reserves for losses. This disparity, replicated across every category of military equipment, determined the war's outcome. Germany made weapons, America made systems, and systems, backed by limitless industrial capacity, buried weapons under sheer weight of material. The half-track's post-war career, spanning 5 more decades, validated every compromise made in its design. A vehicle built for adequacy proved durable enough for 50 years of service. A vehicle built for mass production proved adaptable enough for dozens of specialized roles. A vehicle built for simplicity proved reliable enough that nations still using World War I-era equipment chose it over more modern designs. When the final M3 Halftrack was retired from military service in the 1990s, it had served continuously somewhere in the world for over half a century. This longevity exceeded that of contemporary tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The humble compromise outlasted the sophisticated specialists, and in that longevity was the final proof. The Germans had never expected a simple hybrid vehicle to become one of the war's most effective platforms. They had assessed it as a flawed design, doomed to failure. They were wrong. It succeeded precisely because it embraced compromise. It was the vehicle that did everything adequately rather than one thing perfectly. And in the vast chaos of global war, adequacy multiplied by industrial capacity equaled inevitable victory.